Welcome everyone. This is another audition of Direct Talk. And today I'm joined by Laetitia, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch African Division, to speak about Human Rights Watch report last week on the situation of Tigrayan refugees in eastern Sudan. Laetitia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start with the context. Could you provide an overview of the current situation for refugees in eastern Sudan, particularly for those from western Tigray?
Well, I mean, the broader context is obviously of a conflict which has spread from the capital Khartoum in the early days of the conflict in Sudan and has spread to many different parts of the country. What we've been seeing over the last month or so is the conflict and the rapid support forces in particular starting to attack and move into parts of the country in southern eastern parts of Sudan. And notably in Sennar, in Sinjar, we've seen multiple attacks on towns in that area, which is basically the state neighboring Gedaref, which is the state where two of the main camps which have been hosting predominantly Tigrayan refugees since the conflict started in Tigray in November 2020. And this is where they are living and where they are hosted. So we're speaking of a context in which conflict, which initially started in Khartoum, Sudan's capital, has spread throughout the last 15 months into many different parts of Sudan. And what we've been seeing in the last month or so is that the rapid support forces have been moving into and attacking towns in eastern parts of Sudan, and notably in Sennar, in several towns in that state. And that is obviously the state which is neighboring Gedaref, where two of the refugee camps, the main refugee camps which are hosting Tigrayan refugees and have been hosting Tigrayan refugees since late 2020 when the conflict started in Tigray. So there are real concerns at the moment. There are obviously concerns around issues of humanitarian access to the camps to provide support to the refugees, tens of thousands of refugees who are in these camps, if the conflict were to spread into Gedaref. Gedaref is also a very important point and hub for humanitarian work more generally. So what are the implications in terms of bringing in humanitarian assistance and for the refugees? There are also concerns around potential targeting of the refugees, and maybe we can get into this a bit more. So the alarm bells are very important, and this is why we released a piece raising concerns about the potential implications of the conflict spreading further southeast into the areas where the refugees are.
Okay, Laetitia, how are international organizations and local authorities responding to this crisis, and what gaps have you identified in their humanitarian efforts so far?
Now, I mean, this was a small piece of research. We've obviously continued to remain in touch with Tigrayan and other refugees in the area throughout the conflict on a regular basis. There are several levels to the concerns. In order for refugees to leave the camps, the rules in pre-conflict time were that refugees need to get movement passes, and these rules are still in place. And so it is absolutely critical for the Sudanese authorities in the area to continue to provide those. They have been, but we have heard concerns that this is not happening on the pace that this needs to happen in. And obviously, it's one of the first steps to guarantee safer movement of refugees is that it at least means that they are less likely to be at risk of being arbitrarily detained for not having the movement passes when they leave the camps. There has continued to be a humanitarian presence in the camps, but that has become increasingly fragile, less of a presence, and obviously the humanitarian organizations that are present are also concerned by the movement of the fighting closer and closer to where the camps are, for their own staff, as well, obviously, as for the refugees. So, this is also happening, obviously, in a context where there has been massive underfunding of the more general response to the humanitarian crisis in Sudan. So in some ways what is happening, and in terms of the needs of the refugees, it's within a context of a humanitarian response program right now in Sudan, which is, we're sort of mid-July, halfway through the year, and it is not even 20% funded at this point. So there is massive underfunding generally at a time where the needs of the population in Sudan is absolutely incredibly big and important. So this is the situation in the camps. It is amplified and deteriorating as a result of the conflict dynamics. We're also concerned, of course, of reports that we have not documented ourselves, but we have received reports of ongoing arrests of Ethiopians, refugees from different communities from Ethiopia that have been arrested by the Sudanese armed forces and other groups affiliated with the Sudanese armed forces in the states where the refugees are arriving into Sudan or are living in Sudan. So this is very worrying. So it's not only a question of making sure refugees can safely leave camps, it's also making sure that the refugees have safe movements if and when they leave the camps as well.
So, what key recommendations does Human Rights Watch make to the Sudanese warring parties, to the Tigray Interim Regional Administration, to the Ethiopian government, as well as the international community to address these issues you've mentioned earlier?
Well, as you know, many of the refugees who are in the two camps in Tigray in particular are obviously from Western Tigray. And we have continued to underscore that we have documented, along with Amnesty International, an ethnic cleansing campaign in Western Tigray against the Tigrayan communities there. We continue to receive reports of forceful deportation with the implication of the federal government forces of Tigrayans from Western Tigray zone. So we continue to underscore that if there are any returns of Tigrayan refugees towards Tigray, including towards Western Tigray, this needs to be with the consent of the individuals in a safe way, because we are particularly concerned about ongoing risks of persecutions and other violations against this community if they are forced to return back to where they come from. And obviously, as we know, the risks are also that they will end up amongst the hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people within Tigray, more generally speaking. The recommendations, therefore, are to assist the refugees for them to be able to move in a safe way. Now, it's not an ideal context right now. So what we are saying is for the international organizations to think of different methods, whether it's cash transfers, whether it's possibly providing transport, so that the individuals can make their own decisions about where they feel is a safer place for them to move to and to go to. So this is what we're saying, and we're saying that this needs to happen urgently. There cannot be more delays. These are concerns we've been hearing from the refugees in these camps for months and months and months now. And we've just not seen the sort of prioritization and the kind of thinking outside of the box to make sure that those concerns are heeded to, and that there is a response put in place as quickly as possible. Refugee camps are protected under international humanitarian law. They should be ensuring that they are not targeting civilians. Unfortunately, we have been seeing time and again in this conflict that both warring parties have repeatedly attacked and targeted civilians from many different communities throughout the country. And so the calls are obviously that they need to stop attacking civilians, that they need to protect refugees, protect civilian and refugee movement, of course. There is a specific call, obviously, on the SAF-aligned authorities, because they are the ones who are providing the movement passes. They need to make sure that that is happening, that the administration in the states where the refugees are providing those documents as quickly as possible, alternative to those documents, which will mean that the refugees can safely move. But there is definitely the need for there to be international pressure and also consequences. This is something we have been saying since the beginning of the conflict, is that we have repeatedly seen the two warring parties ignoring commitments they've made during political discussions around the protection of civilians, and this hasn't been happening. And so there needs to be consequences for unlawful detentions of civilians, including Ethiopian refugees, targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure, which obviously refugee camps would be if they don't lose that status. And we're just not seeing the sort of consequences for those actions. And so we continue to see these cycles of abuses.
How about the Ethiopian federal government? What could be its role?
Well, we have seen that they have announced that they would be looking at supporting returns of refugees. I think it is absolutely essential, of course, for the international organizations mandated to support refugees to discuss with the Ethiopian authorities to see if there are refugees who are voluntarily asking to return back to Ethiopia, but there needs to be oversight over that process, and it is absolutely critical, despite the complexities of the context right now, where it's obviously a context in which the voluntary nature is very complicated, when basically refugees are caught between a rock and a hard place, between staying in what could become a conflict zone and returning to places where they feel fear for their lives. But that's why it is absolutely essential that there is oversight over any such returns.
So, Laetitia, what do you think are the urgent and long-term solutions to ensure the safety and security of the refugees in Eastern Sudan, particularly those Tigrayans that flee ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray?
I mean, more broadly, we've obviously called for ongoing investigations, but also accountability for what has happened in terms of the ethnic cleansing campaign and the crimes against humanity that we have documented in Western Tigray zone. We have obviously called for three individuals in particular to be investigated and first and foremost to be removed from their positions of power to ensure that the abuses stop. So there are very concrete actions which need to happen on the side of the Ethiopian federal government to ensure that we don't see the repeated cycles of abuse against Tigrayans in Western Tigray zone. And that is unfortunately something we have continued to call upon because we've continued to receive reports of those abuses to date. And obviously more broadly, there is the need for both warring parties to respect refugees who are in an incredibly, obviously, vulnerable situation at the moment. I mean, as we highlighted in our piece, this is not only Tigrayan refugees and Ethiopian refugees more broadly, it's also Eritrean refugees. We've continued to see Eritreans fleeing forced conscription inside Eritrea, arriving into Sudan and arriving into what is potentially going to be a war zone as well. So there really needs to be thought and pressure to protect refugees who are in an incredibly difficult context at the moment, especially those who can't return home.
Okay, Laetitia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
This wraps up our audition for today. Until next time, bye-bye.